All right. Well, it's great to be back. It's great to be together again. If you're new here, we get to this point in the service. We call it the message. We like to group our messages under a common theme or idea. And over the past few weeks, we've been talking about stories. Not just any stories, but stories that Jesus told. Jesus had a way of telling stories that flipped things upside down. Often they caught his audience totally off guard. His stories often had shocking endings, and they taught really powerful lessons. But before we jump into this week's story, I'll tell you a little story of my own, all right? So some of you know when I was growing up, I was into sports, right? I liked to play basketball, I played football, I played baseball. Not really a big guy, right? And so in a lot of sports, it doesn't really work for you. But what would happen is when things would get competitive, every once in a while, someone would throw an elbow, or start to talk trash. Especially in basketball, if someone threw an elbow. I was like at everybody's elbow height, my face, It's like nailed in the face, and it would get under my skin. Or if I get hit in a football game, like people, they'd be like on top of me, and they'd like say something, start to talk trash. I'd be like, ugh, want to get back at them. But what am I going to do, right? And then one day, somebody taught me a certain way to react when somebody does something to you in an athletic event. I'm not going to say who it was because it's not important. But he said, when someone does that to you, somebody tries to get under your skin, somebody throws an elbow at you, somebody shoves you, he said, just look at them and smile and laugh at them. And he's like, there is no better way to get someone back than to let them know you don't even take them seriously. And I was like, nah, I don't know about that, But then I tried it. And the first time I remember everything inside of me was angry and I was frustrated, but I remembered I was like, heh. And the person on the other end was just like fury, right? And it did help me get back at them, but it never helped the situation, often just escalated the situation. But I was like, finally, I have a way to get back at people. And so this became for me, I'm not proud of this became a reflex. It became a reflex for me. I did it long enough intentionally that eventually it came naturally to me. And so people would say stuff to me and I just and it would hurt. It would hurt on the inside. I'd be like, okay, good. And it would just I'd get them back and get them back. This became a problem when this left the world of sports and seeped into my outside of sports relationships. Like when I got married, this was a problem. And that's when I realized how destructive this was. And for a long time, I had to work, and still honestly do have to work, at overriding this reflex. When I get angry, it's probably better to just let my hurt be known than to laugh at the person on the other side. But this was a way I learned to get back at people. It was a reflex. And it wasn't helpful. It didn't fix it, but it made me feel like I could get them back. So my question for you is, what is your reflex look like? What's your reflex when you've been wronged? Do you laugh at them? Do you get angry, power up? You cut them off? You don't pick up their phone calls anymore? You ghost them? Shun them? Keep track? Remember what they did? Wait for the right time to bring it up? What's your reflex when you've been wronged? Think about that. Here's another question. What's your reflex, not when you've been wronged, but when you've been righted, right? When someone has done good for you, when they've gone above and beyond, they've gone out of their way, they've been thoughtful, they've been caring, they have done good for your sake. What's your reflex? How do you respond? What's your natural response? There's this story that Jesus told, and the story is so deep and so complex, and there are so many aspects and angles to the story. You can read it over and over and over again. I feel like every time I read it, I get something different out of it. But this story challenges what we think our natural reflexes really are. And what I love about this story is it's one of those stories where you don't need to be a follower of Jesus. You don't need to buy into the whole church thing to give this a shot and to actually see it work in your relationships. But Jesus says something about our reflexes, tells a story that shows us something about our reflexes, and offers a solution within the story that I think for you could be helpful, and for me could be helpful when it comes to our relationships. And so here we go. Here's the story. This is in the Good News about Jesus according to Matthew, who was there for all of it. And so he remembers that Jesus told a story. He said, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wants to settle accounts with his servants. Now, when he says the kingdom of heaven is like, he's not talking about some like distant land above the clouds, like Never Land out there, like there's this place where things are like this. He's talking about what life looks like when God is king. In other places, the gospel writers call this the kingdom of God. Those terms are used interchangeably. Matthew was writing to a primarily Jewish audience, and they were a lot more hesitant to use the name God, and so he swaps out God with heaven. But the idea is, okay, so just like when you're living as if God is in control, right? As if his kingdom is the kingdom you live in and his will is being done, remember that, right? It's like, this is what it's like. It's like a king who wants to settle accounts with his servants. And right away, we're introduced to the God figure in the story, the king. And here's what happens. It says, as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Now, the reason the guy didn't come to him on his own is because he owed him 10,000 bags of gold. Now, if you like to study the original language here, there's actually a form of currency. It's called a talent. In the original language, it says 10,000 talents. Some conservative estimates would say that a talent was somewhere around $400,000, okay? So if you want to do a little math, take 10,000, multiply that by 400,000, and we're at 4 billion. All right, little mental math. I did that beforehand. It's a lot of money, and that's a conservative estimate. Others would say it's 20 years worth of salaries, one talent. So 10,000 of those, okay, in essence, Jesus is telling this story. He's like, all right, so there's this guy, he owes a king $1 gazillion. That's the equivalent, right? They're all like, okay, this guy is a reckless fool. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a bad investment. This guy is just reckless. And so Jesus says, well, since he was unable to pay, not but he was able to pay, since, because everyone knows there's no way he's going to be able to pay, the master, the king, ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Now, if you're listening to this story, you're like, yes, of course. In fact, this is probably a more generous course of action. The guy is trying to recoup some of his losses, and this was normal in the ancient world. People who ended up in slavery often sold themselves into slavery or were sold into slavery to try and repay a debt, and you can be a slave and then work your way out of it, right? This guy's never going to work his way out of it, but this was understandable. Like, no one's sitting there thinking, oh, what a mean king. They're just thinking like, okay, he's trying to get back some of his money. But here's what happens. It says, at this, the servant fell on his knees before him, and he says, be patient with me, and I will pay back everything. Now, this is like foolish thing number 2 about this guy. He doesn't need patience. He needs to win the lottery, right? There's no way he's going to be able to pay this back. The picture that's being painted is someone who's just reckless. Reckless. And it says, the servant's master took pity on him. Now, when I hear the word pity, I think right away, pathetic, like pity. Right? A lot of people, they don't want to be pitied. But that doesn't have the negative connotation here that we have in our culture. The word in the original language, there's an expression here actually that's being used. The expression is to yearn in your bowels, right? Anyone ever yearned in there? I'm just kidding. Okay. But for us, the equivalent would be like saying his heart went out to him. Like he stopped and he felt for this guy's desperation. Like set aside his fault and thought his whole future is about to change. Like the future of his family, his wife, his kids, it's all about to be radically, radically different. And he feels, and it says that he canceled the debt, canceled it, and he let him go. Now, if you're sitting there listening to Jesus, you're like, what? If you know this story, you might be jumping ahead to scene 2, right? But just come back for a minute and just stick right here. This was shocking. This was the first shocking part of this story. They're like, there's no way the king would excuse this. In fact, in ancient Israel, if you had taken something from someone, you had to pay it back, and often several times over. So if you couldn't do that, you were just written off as someone who's hopeless. This guy would have been written off as someone who's hopeless. And the king, he doesn't put him on he doesn't file for an extension. He's not like, okay, you can try to work it back. He just cancels it. He cancels it. Now, right here is the picture of what the kingdom of God is like, what it looks like to live as if God is king. This is the first part of it. I don't know about you, but for a long time, this was not how I understood the whole Christianity, church, following Jesus, whatever you want to call it. This was not how I understood it. Right? The king has the opportunity to cancel everything, and he does. For me, I understood Christianity, if I'm going to buy into this, if I'm going to do this, it's like he takes out a ledger. And now you've got to live with a ledger. The story here is Jesus saying the king leaves behind the ledger. But for so many of us, we think about church, we think about God, we think about following Jesus, and it's like, all right, well, now I'm signed up for God to watch me at a distance and keep track of the things that I do, And so it feels like there's God, just waiting, oh, heard you say the F word, that was one too many drinks. Should we really be watching that show? If you're someone who's new to church and that's how you picture God, then it's time to repaint the picture. It's not life with a ledger. The story is that God leaves behind the ledger. And it's not to say he doesn't care about how you live. He does, because he cares about you and he wants you to thrive. And so there is transformation and life change, but it's for your good, not because he's keeping score and one day you're going to find out what the final score is. The king leaves behind the ledger. There are some, I'm willing to bet, and I could be totally wrong, but I bet there are some people who have been in church for years, maybe decades even, who are still living as if God is watching them with a ledger. If your faith feels heavy, if it feels like a have to instead of a get to, if you feel like you've got to perform, if you feel like you got to put on your Christian hat, you might be living as if God has a ledger. And the story is right off the bat, this guy who owes an unbelievable amount, his debt is canceled. It's radical. It's radical. Okay, so there it is. There's part 1, right? Now, this is a pretty amazing story if you think about it. The guy owes $4 billion and instantly it's gone. His portfolio is transformed. It's a weight lifted. So the question is, well, what's his reflex? What is he going to do? He's just been given an unbelievable gift. What does he do? What would you do? Throw a party? Right? Everything has just been changed. This burden is gone. The thing that you thought about, you dreaded the day the king was going to call you in, right? But it's all gone now. So what does he do? Well, Jesus tells us, he's but when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants, one of his pals, who owed him 100 silver coins. Now, 100 silver coins, the currency back then, it's not a small amount. That would probably be 3 months of work. But it's not $4 billion. And so he finds that guy, and what does he do, right? Think you ever see Christmas Carol? At the end, Scrooge is transformed, Scrooge McDuck, the one with the Disney people, that's the one I saw. He's thrilled, and he's throwing money out, he's kissing babies, he's transformed because his life has changed. And that's what we picture here. And so he finds someone who owes him money, and he grabs him, and he hugs him, and he cancels his debt, right? Because that's what you would do naturally. But that's not actually what he does. No, there wasn't an emoji when Matthew was around. He began to choke him, and he says, "Pay back what you owe me." He demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him. He says, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." Remember those words? Be patient with me, and I will pay it back. Yeah, that's right. Light bulb, I was just here. Nope. It says, but he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he can pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, it says they were outraged and went and told their master, the king, everything that had happened. And when he found out, he wasn't happy either. It says, then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" The word mercy here has this idea of care, of empathy. Shouldn't you have felt for the need of that person just like I did for you? The answer, this is a rhetorical question. The answer is yes, yes. That's why everyone's outraged. And the unmistakable point here, first, that Jesus is making is not just that God is radically forgiving, but that what should come naturally, what everyone expects to come naturally, doesn't always come naturally. Immediately, he challenges the reflex. If there's anyone who should know what it feels like to have someone before you even says the same exact words, it's him, but he doesn't. There are these guys, their names are Chip and Dan Heath. They like to write books. I've talked about them before. They wrote The Power of Moments, Made to Stick. They talk about this thing called the curse of knowledge. And the idea of the curse of knowledge is that once you know something, we tend to forget what it's like to not know that thing. And the same is true for situations. Once we've moved on from someplace, we tend to forget what it was like to be where we once were. Right? Because it's not natural to remember. It's natural to forget. And what doesn't come naturally must be done intentionally. It's not natural to remember. It's natural to forget. It's not natural for a teacher to remember what it's like to be a student. It's not natural for a parent to remember what it's like to be a kid. It's not natural for someone who's in church to remember what it feels like to not be in church. To remember that feeling of being an outsider, like that awkward feeling of walking to a new place for the first time. Those are things that need to be done intentionally because we tend to forget. It's not natural to remember, it's natural to forget. So I see this and I'm like, well, why, right? Like, why did this happen? What went wrong? Like, can we diagnose the problem? And this is part of the story where you can look at this for hours and hours and hours. This is what's so cool about these stories. There's so much to them. But I think the most obvious reason why this guy does what he does, the reason he doesn't show mercy is because he's right. He's right. If you chop off the first part of this story and you just zoom in to his current situation, he's right. Not doing anything wrong. I mean, he shouldn't have choked the guy. That was excessive. But there was someone who owed him a significant amount of money. And he demanded what he was owed. And if you're struggling to let go of something that someone has done to you, right? This story is about forgiveness. It's about a lot more than forgiveness, but forgiveness is a big part of it. If you're struggling to let go because someone's wronged you, it might be because you're right. They had no right to do what they did, to say what they said, to ask for what they asked for, to cross that line, to go to that place. They had no right. They're wrong and you're right. And you might be. You might be. Until you zoom out and you step back and find out, whoa, this guy was just forgiven this, a debt of an unbelievable amount was just canceled. Now he's unwilling to cancel that. And everyone's outraged. It's universal outrage when you know the whole story, right? It would be like, let's say my brother lives with us and I charge him rent. And so for 3 months, he doesn't pay rent, right? That's significant. That's frustrating. And if I were to say, hey, enough, and I turn off the Wi-Fi or the power or the water or whatever, but I do something to like demand what's mine, you're like, oh, I guess that's reasonable. It's unfortunate, but it's reasonable. But if I told you, yeah, I know, I'm so annoyed. Anyway, last week, my parents gave us a check. They actually paid off my whole house. Now I owe nothing. But yeah, no, my brother owes me this money. You'd be like, what? Like all of a sudden, the situation changes. And so what if you just zoom out? Maybe you've been wronged. Maybe he did something that was not okay. But what happened before that? Maybe she said something she shouldn't have said, but what happened before that? What if we got curious and just kept backing up and backing up and backing up? You might see, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, that there was something that contributed to that, and maybe it changes the story if you zoom out. But it's not natural to zoom out. It's natural to zoom in and demand what's yours, to see your situation in light of your situation and nothing else, especially when you've been wronged. That's the reflex. That's what's natural. Now, if he would have backed up, what he would have seen is that the king, for him, the king stopped, and what did he do? He felt pity. Remember the yearning? He felt for him. His heart went out to him. He set aside his fault and felt what it might be like to be in that situation. What if he did that? Like, the reason this guy went wrong is because he saw his situation in light of his situation and jumped to a conclusion. But what if he slowed down, stopped and reflected? There's a guy, his name's Dallas Willard. He actually passed away not too long ago, but he's really into spiritual growth. He writes a lot about it. And one of the things he says, I'll never forget this, he says the biggest enemy of spiritual growth for us, the thing that gets in the way of our spiritual development, our faith continuing to grow, it's hurry. It's like we're in such a rush. And so we jump to conclusions. We see things with a limited perspective. Not too long ago, I was going to see one of my good friends in New Hampshire, and my plan was to take the ferry out of Port Jeff to go to Bridgeport and then drive the rest of the way up. And I was going there to relax. It was his birthday. We were going to go skiing, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go relax, celebrate my friend's birthday with him, go skiing. And so it's like the day of, and I'm getting stuff done before it's time to go out. I'm like in the execution mode. I'm just checking things off my to-do list. Then it's time to go, but I had a few more things to do, so I got those things done. Then I had to get on the road and catch that ferry. So we got in the car, and I start driving, and I'm flying to Port Jeff. And as I'm driving, I'm like, all right, it's going to be a long ride. I better get my phone plugged in. I open up the console. I don't have the right iPhone cable because they switched the charging port 45,000 times. And so I don't know how I'm going to connect my thing. And I'm feeling like my blood pressure rise, and I'm racing to get to this ferry because I'm going someplace to relax. And so I stopped and I pulled over, took a breath, and just tried to gain some perspective. I was like, you know what? I don't need to make the ferry. I could drive around, go home, get my charger. And I did. I walked in the house. My wife looked at me. She's like, what happened? I was like, I'm going to slow down. She's like, who are you? But I pulled over. I think in some of our relationships, like maybe there's an issue, and maybe all you need to do is pull over and zoom out, get some perspective. Like set aside fault and get curious. Like think, why would they do what they did? Put yourself in their shoes. Think about if the relationship is worth this argument. Is it worth it? Is it worth being right? Is it worth the time that's spent where the two of you are like this? But we're in such a rush. We're going so fast. We don't stop to feel for what it's like to be on the other side of me. You'd say the one who stops the reflex is the one who stops and reflects. Just gain some perspective. The story might change. It might change, and your feelings might follow. So then there's this other part of the story. All right, I'm just warning you. This is like one of those God's gonna get you passages. All right, so buckle up. Here we go. It says, in anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured. Remember, this was after the shouldn't you have felt for him? He hands him over to the jailers to be tortured. Now, in the original language, this is actually a certain type of jailer that does the torturing. Oh, that's nice. Until he paid back all he owed. Now, I read that, I'm like, okay, well, clearly this is just Jesus ending the story, but we've exhausted the metaphor here because God wouldn't do that to us, right? And then it says, Jesus says this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. And I read that, and I audibly groaned. I was like, oh. But this is a great place, especially if you were with us for our Making Sense series of the Bible. This is a great place to zoom out. Look at the bigger picture, right? Is God some sadistic torturer that just wants people to pay, right? Like, does this line up with the picture of God that Jesus painted in everything else that he taught? The point here, and you know this, the point here is that when you live with a ledger in your relationships, when you hold on to the faults of other people, when you're tracking how and when people have wronged you, when you're keeping track of who owes you, do you know who pays for that? You do. And I do when I do that. We are the ones that pay when we choose to withhold forgiveness. And I know that's easy to say, but I'm sure there are people in your life, you know them, where it's like they're ready to catch where people are out of place. They've got a problem with this one because she said that, and that one because he said this, and you know what they did to me this week, and they're miserable. It's like it's torturing them. But they don't see it. And if I'm honest, I'll do the same thing and I won't see it. And maybe you do it and you don't see it. We are the ones who end up paying. Now, if you're someone who's not a church person and you don't believe in God, you're not sure about Jesus, this whole thing, right? Well, this could be helpful for you, but it's kind of as far as I can take you. Right? And so my advice for you would be like, in your relationships, stop, slow down, pull over, and reflect. See the bigger picture. And it may help bring resolution. But if you're someone who follows Jesus, then there's a king in your story who canceled your debt. And the idea is that God looks at the ugliest parts of me, like the most twisted, self-gratifying, selfish parts of me, and he doesn't excuse them. He doesn't say, well, all right, if I think about it, you kind of had a reason for acting that way, and so I'm willing to look the other way. No, he looks at the things that are inexcusable, and he chooses not to hold them against me. That's a canceled debt. And if we'll sit and like maybe pull over and think of that, like I've got my issues. Like there are things within me that I just can't excuse. They're just selfish. And when they show up, God chooses to not hold them against me. There is something about that when I look at someone who's wronged me and I can't excuse it, I can't come up with the reason. What they did was just selfish. Like when I know that God has not held that against me. There is something about that that gives me the ability to say, okay, I'll overlook, I'll let go of what's inexcusable in you. This is the economy of what Jesus would call the kingdom of God. Now, an important disclaimer, okay? What I'm not saying, when I say forgive, what I'm not saying is you put yourself in a situation where you're going to continue to be hurt, or you put yourself in danger, or you let him move back in, or whatever the situation is, right? The king does not give that servant 10,000 more talents to go blow, but he doesn't hold it against him. And within you, there's part of you, you can choose to hold it against him or not. But if you do, if Jesus meant what he said and knew what he was talking about, then you're the one that pays for that. Then I'm the one that pays for that. So the question this week, in your life right now, who needs you to pull over? Like, where do you just need to stop and gain some perspective? Maybe it's in a relationship with a parent, a neighbor, a kid. To put yourself in their shoes, to feel what they feel. To zoom out, see the bigger story. It might change how you feel about it. We're out of time, so I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. But I'll leave you this story. So some of you have heard of how this church started. It's a pretty amazing story. There's some pretty magical moments, things that we can't explain. It's been unbelievable. But in 2019, we came into this area, and we were gonna start the church in some other place that we were renting. But I made a friend, the pastor actually, who was here at a church called First Baptist Church of Babylon. He was very nice, very welcoming. His name was Wayne Griffiths. Super, super generous. He had all these questions about what we were doing. Amazing person. We became really good friends. A relationship of trust developed between the two of us. And one day he asked me, he's like, what would you do if you could do anything here? And with all the courage that I had, I said, honestly, if we're talking about how we can do the most good for people in this community, I think if you close down your church, invited your people to join our launch team, and handed things over to what Community Church was doing, I think we could help a lot of people. I was scared. I thought he was going to slap me, right? Because it's a pretty big thing to ask for. But I needed him to think outside of his four walls, right? To see the bigger picture. And he did. And that's why we're here today. It's why you are where you are in your seat today. Because of someone like that. Someone with radical generosity. It's amazing. It was a magical moment. But there were some other moments that were not so magical. Not long after that, after the church had started, there was a couple that approached me from another state. They were moving to Long Island. And they said they wanted to start a church. I was excited for them. I was like, oh, this is so fun, great, cool, we did that. And then they started asking for things. Small things. But things that were going to cost me and the church. And I would love to tell you that I was generous, but I was not. I got weird and territorial and jealous of the excitement of what was happening over there. Until there was a moment where things became clear and I realized I'm the guy. If there's anyone who should understand what it feels like to try to start something new, to be in that position, it should have been me. But I didn't. I missed it. And I had all the reasons why I felt like I was right and this was not okay. But at the end of the day, it was selfish. Now, eventually, I can tell you that I realized that. And I told the guy, I apologized to him. We now support them as a church, and he and I are very close friends. But that wasn't what happened at first, because that wasn't my natural response. And what's not natural, what we don't do naturally, we have to do intentionally. It wouldn't have happened if right off the bat I would have pulled over and gained some perspective and realized, I was just in that position. And how was I treated? And so Who needs you to pull over and gain perspective? Because there are none of us that are out of the reach of situations like this. You might be surprised to see the clarity that you find when you pull over.